Hey, we are live. How exciting. So, hello, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm here. I'm Becky Carlzon. I introduced myself first. So, I run two learning communities, Learning Pioneers and Press Play, and I'm a classroom practitioner. And I'm here with Tara Kerr, who is also in Learning Pioneers and is an early childhood educator. And Tara and I chat lots about education and changing education and practical approaches to education. So we thought that we would have a chat and invite you all to be part of that chat and to interact in that chat. So StreamYard's kind of new to us. I'm fairly sure that if you're on LinkedIn, you can post comments and we'll see them. And if you're on Twitter or Facebook, I think you can comment afterwards, but we'd love to hear from you. So that's me, and I'll hand over to you, Tara. Would you like to introduce yourself too?
Sure. My name is Tara. I am an early childhood educator, but I'm actually transitioning out of the classroom. I actually already transitioned out of the classroom. I just moved back from Bangkok, Thailand, where I lived for 10 years. I worked at an international school, which you'll find out later is reggio inspired, but I won't speak too much about that right now. But yeah, now I'm kind of exploring the world beyond the classroom, but still in education.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. And just it's just a joy to be sharing a space and sharing, well, as Neil Mercer would call it, lots of interthinking between like ideas and pedagogy and inspiring and thinking about things moving forward. So the kind of what we've kind of got planned to talk about today is a general discussion about pedagogy and impactful things in the classroom. And also, one of our current, I'm going to call it obsessions, is looking at links between pedagogical approaches. Because if we can find really purposeful links, we can really consciously understand what we're putting into place in our classrooms and schools and why, and be really proactive, thoughtful, and mindful about how we're developing classroom environments and learning contexts so that learning is more purposeful, meaningful, and joyous. Those are kind of three of my words to kind of improve education. So within that, we've been looking at the links between the learning power approach, which is kind of one of my obsessions, and I've written a book with Guy Claxton about that in primary, and inquiry, which is what we're looking at in Learning Pioneers and reggio emilia and project-based learning, and how those different approaches can connect and enhance one another and kind of support one another. I'm going to add play and STEAM to that list as well, because I think that's really key and important. So we're going to be talking about that. But first of all, we kind of want to be looking at practice a little bit. So I was going to ask you, Tara, you've joined Learning Pioneers recently and you've become an advocate, and we so appreciate you. Like, we've loved you being part of that and being so interactive and living our values and supporting our community. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about Learning Pioneers, what your first impressions are, what kind of things you're putting into practice, and how Learning Pioneers has been for you so far.
Exactly what you said, purposeful and joyous. Discovering Learning Pioneers was kind of one of the best, I would say, one of the highlights of my year, because this was a year of transition for me to go out of the classroom. Normally I would have access to PD, professional development, collaboration with my colleagues, but now outside of the classroom, I was worried to lose that, but I have not. I've actually gained more, that and more, through Learning Pioneers, because I feel like I've been connected to this community of such a group of such supportive but like empowered educators. Everybody is so amazing, and everybody's basically a lifelong learner, and that's kind of what I want to continue doing. So Learning Pioneers has been amazing for me, particularly at this moment in my life, transitioning into this big world of education. So I feel like I'm going through it with access to really high quality content, and we're doing book studies, and I'm gaining so much out of it. And another thing that's super important that I love about Learning Pioneers is that it's kind of tapping into educators' professional and personal development. We do so many master classes on coaching and boundary setting, and these are very useful kind of topics as a teacher, as an individual. So yeah,
Mhm.
one of my biggest takeaways right now, currently something we're discussing, was a book that we all read. our most recent book study on it was called When the Adults Change, Everything Changes. And my biggest takeaway is this idea of building emotional currency, the idea that rich relationships are built over time. I believe the author calls it a drip effect. I feel like we've all been discussing this a lot. It's been kind of um, popping up everywhere in the community. And that's something that I'm really thinking about actively.
Thank you so much. And that, yeah, so much I could pick up on there, but just thinking about that kind of currency and slow learning, there's often different themes that come up at different times in Learning Pioneers, and it just seems to come up across the board. So it will be just a feeling. I guess it's part of being in a community. It's like the flock moves together, and there are themes that come up, and one that's really, really present at the moment is well, I guess it's two themes. One is slowing down your thinking, and being slow and steady wins the race. That's come up a couple of times. And the second is the real importance of that foundation of really strong, deep relationships. And I think it's been really profound how, you kind of describe the educators that are in Learning Pioneers and how they're lifelong learners, and they always want to learn more and always want to get better. And when we circle back to what's the most important thing, relationships so often comes back to that conversation. And you've just joined Learning Pioneers, but it also kind of circles around. So we had Mark Finnis and Robert Lowe inspiring us about relationships, and now we circle back around with Paul Dix, and he adds layers of depth to our understanding around that. So that becomes really powerful as it kind of circles back round. Yeah, there was something else you said that I was thinking about. So my next question was going to be, and I'm sure I'll reflect back on some of the things you shared before, and you got Learning Pioneers in a nutshell. It's like when you're designing and co-designing something like that, all you wish for is it fulfills what it's supposed to. So if you reflecting that back and describing that, it's like, yeah, that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be there to be supportive. It's supposed to be there to help you make links. It's supposed to be there to add depth. So when it's achieving that, it's like, yes, we're on the right track. But yeah, just in terms of, you were mentioning you're out of the classroom at the moment, but what are you taking from the discussions in the masterminds and different elements of Learning Pioneers that you're thinking, I can't wait to put that in practice in a classroom, or to work with teachers to put that in practice?
Oh, so many. There's so many times something will pop up, or we'll read something, or somebody will say something in a mastermind, and I'll either be like, oh, why did I not do that in the classroom? Or, oh wow, I kind of want to go back to the classroom just to try that out. So I mean, maybe one day I will get that opportunity, but even if I don't, I mean, this knowledge is so powerful. I'm exploring different avenues of where to go. Like maybe I'll go into teacher professional development. There's a lot going on there. Maybe I'll work in a company, who needs some educational consulting. These are all really powerful things that I can use and I can take and translate, to a different context. So, but yes, there's times I'm like, oh, I wish I could just maybe 6 months take over someone's mat leave and just like implement these things. But
yeah, no, I love what you shared there, and that links back to the kind of professional and personal growth piece, because and just linking that as well with one of our lead thinkers who's inspired a lot of our thinking, Kath Murdoch, and she talks about transporting learning, and kind of when she shared with our community, she was talking about like habits of learning. So let's say perseverance. Here's you persevering over here, and you can pick that up and move that over here, and you can persevere in this context too. And the more I think about the development of Learning Pioneers community and practice, the more I see kind of as within, as without. It's like what we develop in our classrooms and schools is what we're developing Learning Pioneers. And you can take that and you can apply it to your family life, your relationships with your community,
yeah.
Your relationships in school. So it all intertwines, and that's where that kind of professional, personal growth, you can't have one without the other. Like they both feed one another. And actually that personal growth aspect is so key, because we're never going to feel properly fulfilled if we can't set boundaries, if we can't take care of our own well-being. It's always going to be like chasing our tail a bit. So
Definitely. And I feel like, I mean, I had such an amazing experience as an educator in the classroom. I worked at great schools, but I do feel like the personal is often yeah, it's not as prioritized as the professional, and it really should be. And it's actually the answer to so many not even problems, so many challenges. Is work on a teacher's like support teachers to enhance their personal growth. It's only going to benefit children and families too.
That's a conversation I was just having with a school leader in Australia, actually, and she was talking about how in her school they so highly prioritize professional learning, and she was talking about investing in teachers and their growth, and she was talking about how, you know, we need to invest in the children's growth and the children's learning and the teachers' growth and the teachers' learning. And I was saying, well, you can't really invest in children's learning without investing in teachers' learning.
Totally.
That's the starting point, is investing in the adults who are going to be the caretakers, inspirers, curators of learning. If they really know how to model their own well-being, if they know how to build relationships, children are going to pick up on that all the time, for starters. And then if they're explicitly and very mindfully planning how that learning design is going to take place, they know exactly what they've put in place and why. And not only that, they become bulletproof if anyone wants to come in and try and judge them on what they're doing, because they know why they're doing it. So they're really
Definitely.
strong and confident in it.
I'll even take that one step further. I feel like families too. I mean, there's so much that as educators, we can be trained or empowered to empower parents too. There's so many little things that, parents, there's a lot of parents out there who are like actually I'd say most parents are so invested in their child's growth and they're willing to learn. It's just a matter of us sort of sharing the insights that we learn.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that's a really great example. I knew this conversation would go like this, like because just in our leadership mastermind yesterday, one of our leaders has been so Robert Cleary in Sandringham has been asking questions in our community, and then has pulled that all together for a really meaningful parent kind of parent meeting to support parents and help them see different ways that they can support their learning at home as well. So he's kind of combined James Clear's habit kind of books on atomic habits with thinking about how to articulate dispositions for learning with parents so that they really understand them, and bring that all together in a really powerful parent meeting where they're unpicking and discussing how tricky parenting can be and what strategies can we put in place and how can we help children organize themselves so that they have control and ownership over that organization, so that they then have that baseline to continue that learning. And just so my head's firing off in so many directions. There's an incredible educator called Mitch Weathers we're connected on LinkedIn, and his kind of thing is developing executive function skills, one of which is kind of self-organization. And that's like a prerequisite to any kind of learning, is to be organized and clear and have everything in place so that you can use that as a launch pad into learning. So it's so multifaceted.
I'm writing that name down right now.
Yeah, you'll love Mitch. I'll let him know that he's been name checked. I didn't plan on speaking about him. He's a really incredible person, and what he's doing is really purposeful and impactful in the schools he's working with. And you'd love it. You get on very well.
I'm sure I would.
So moving on then, because I know the next topic is going to be really rich, about thinking about those links between the learning power approach and reggio emilia. So just a little bit of a kind of background and preamble with that for anyone who's listening or watching back, just to give a whistle-stop tour of the learning power approach if you're not aware of it. The learning power approach is developed by Guy Claxton, and it looks at developing children as lifelong learners. So it has two frameworks that it works within. One of which is design principles, based on Ron Berger's research and work with expeditionary learning schools. What are you designing and purposely putting in place to design learning in your school? So one example of a design principle for the learning power approach would be collaboration, because collaboration is a way that children can support feedback on one another's learning, come up with new ideas together. So in a learning powered classroom, you very purposely think about how and when collaboration might be appropriate. So that's one framework, is the kind of design principles. And the other framework is looking at the elements of learning power. So what is a powerful learner? How do we break down what powerful learning habits are? And if you work in early years in the UK, or work within in an international school using the British curriculum, you'll know about the characteristics of effective learning. Or in IB schools and PYP schools, the learner attributes. They're all kind of crossovers of the same framework. So we're really interested in how this framework can then connect with different curricula, different approaches, so that they can enhance and support one another. So from that, what links are you seeing from your reggio perspective between the Reggio Emilia approach and the learning power approach?
Oh my gosh, so many. So I've actually, a little disclaimer, I'm reading Becky's book, Powering Up Children. I haven't finished. I'm a slow reader, but the more I read it, the more I interact with Learning Pioneers community. I see just a thousand links, but there's a few things that really have been speaking out to me. So number one is, there was actually a line in the book, but something that we often discuss is that a good activity starts where the child is at. So that's basically the foundation of Reggio Emilia. One of the pillars of the Reggio Emilia approach is the idea of the image of the child, which is kind of the adult's perception of the child. And basically that is that the child is a powerful learner. The child is competent, creative, and full of potential. So our job as educators in a Reggio environment is to kind of help children build that image of themselves. We have that image of them, and we're going to help them build that image of themselves. So that they know that they're the agents of their own learning. There's so much happening in the classroom, so many choices, so many things, so many ways for the child to access that powerful learner within. So basically empowering, this idea of power is really embedded into every aspect of our teaching. And I really see this the more I read about the LPA, the more I listen to my fellow Learning Pioneer sort of members, the more I hear the image of the child kind of resonating. And yeah, it's just a different way of phrasing it.
Yeah. So I mean, really, the kind of crux of that image of the child as a learner is what the learning power approach is. It's like, how do I see myself? It's that kind of metacognitive aspect of,
yes.
What is learning, and how is that reflected within what I'm learning?
Yeah, and something that's really interesting that I guess I taught in my previous school for 6 years, and kind of the trajectory of how it always went was, first the children would explore the self, then their friendships, then how do they see themselves as a community. So yeah, the image kind of like shifts. And I think in an ideal educational space, we would spend more time cultivating an image of the adult too, but more on that later.
Yeah, well, that real understanding of self is the basis of self-empowerment, self-love, like self-belief. So again, we were kind of talking about that, with the executive functions part, you can't really, and the kind of for ourselves, without setting boundaries, without having well-being, we can't really be the best versions of ourselves without knowing who we are. We're not going to get as far as we might if we have that connection.
That's so true.
Yeah, and there was a little I get my learning from all sorts of different avenues. Learning Pioneers itself is just a hive of learning for me. And all the books I read and the interactions on social media and visiting schools. But I'm just remembering one interaction on social media with Kath Murdoch. I can't quite remember what the kind of provocation, the trigger of it was, but it was talking about self-reflection, making the unconscious conscious, which is one of our little kind of tag phrases in Learning Pioneers. Like, how can we really examine what we're doing, pay conscious attention to it, figure out if we still want to do it, and then continue or reframe what we're doing without blame, without shame, just kind of looking at that cycle. And the kind of conclusion of that conversation was talking about the importance of inquiry into self. So important, and when do we get the chance to really think about that? truths that kind of, and again, to do that, you have to slow down.
Definitely. Yep.
Mm.
Exactly.
So what else are you noticing with reggio and the LPA? What other links are you kind of picking up?
So a lot of, like I said, many things, but there were a few big things that really spoke to me. So this other idea, I think I'll go on to the environment, the idea of the
Mm.
environment. Environment as a third teacher is one of another really big pillar of the reggio approach. So basically, the third teacher comes after adults and other children. So in a reggio environment, in a reggio classroom or a reggio school, the environment is extremely intentionally planned. Basically, the idea is that the idea behind it is that aesthetics um, inspire creativity and wonder, and that's where really powerful learning. That's where children can, really untap the, the knowledge within, the ideas and the experiences that will be to come. So in reggio, they talk a lot about aesthetics and a lot about nature and a lot about beauty too. And something that I learned, a little interesting thing I learned from my own experience at a reggio inspired school, and actually in Reggio Emilia, which I had the pleasure of visiting, is that this idea of beauty is not necessarily what an adult finds beautiful. Basically, it's this idea that there's beauty in everything. There's beauty in decay. This was so cool. When I went to Reggio, they had a nature atelier. And it was really amazing what they created. But part of it was that nature would take its course on it. And things would decay and get brown and rusted and everything, but they wouldn't interfere with that. That's
Mhm.
what would get the children more, curious and inspired and everything. So basically what I'm saying is that the physical environment, it plays a huge factor in reggio, and we talk a lot about it. I noticed that in the when I'm reading your book, Becky, I'm kind of seeing the same. We talk a lot about the physical environment, the furniture, the layout, but I'm kind of seeing like a fourth teacher. It's kind of like the atmosphere,
Mm.
as an environment, kind of like the culture that you create is actually an environment in and of itself. Yes,
Mm.
that exists in reggio, but we don't explicitly talk about it. We're talking so much about, like for a classroom, little spaces, furniture, the provocations we set up, the materials we put up. But in the learning power approach, I'm seeing that like the intangible is also part of the environment.
Mm. That's so yeah, I don't know what the word is. I love it.
That was
No, I
like a
love
long way of explaining that.
no, really good though. And when we interviewed Anne Van Dam and Kath Murdoch, they were talking about the importance of the emotional environment, and that so links to those relationships, that well-being, and like you said, the
Definitely.
atmosphere. It's almost like when you have a safe, nurturing, inspiring space, it's intangible. It's hard to put your fingers on it, but it's been purposefully curated.
Yes,
It's like magic. What's the magic you've put in here? But then
exactly.
there'll have been, it's like that unconscious conscious thing again. There's intentional things that have gone into that, and um there'll be subtle things like body language, or that just smiling, or the way you respond to children, getting down to child height, simple
Language.
things.
Language is huge.
Yeah.
That's like one of the biggest factors that builds a powerful culture of learning,
Mm.
the
Mm.
words you choose to use with children.
Yeah. And that's, I don't, are you on chapter 4 at the moment? Is that where you are in the book?
Chapter 5.
Chapter 5. So that's the language one.
Yeah.
If I'm remembering my book correctly? Yeah, so that's one thing. It's so interesting because obviously in creating the book and creating the direction of the book, Guy and I had lots of reflective discussions about which chapters should go where and what should the order be and why. And so the reason they're in that order, like inside information, like the first, that design principle of making the classroom a safe to learn place to learn, that's got to come first. You've got to have that kind of safe launch pad.
Definitely.
And when Guy and I have discussed that's good teaching and learning, that's just good. It's good practice. But then building on that for the learning power approach, we went to the learning environment next because it was so tangible. So it's so often something that you can start to envisage and start to see and play with, and it's not so abstract. And then we went into language because we decided that at the time, the opinions change and thoughts change, and we know how guys' thinking changes all the time. But at the time, the discussion was around how language was the most intangible yet most important design principle. And it's because of that making the unconscious conscious again. It's because our language becomes like habits and unconscious habits.
Yes.
Like I noticed the other day that I was using the phrase, oh, I've got a bee in my bonnet about that. And I was like, where did I get that from? I sound like an 80-year-old woman, because it's like, it's just part of my language. So I'm going to work really hard to like come up with a better phrase. A cooler phrase than that. But it is like language it's so hard to change and pay attention to, and it's like learning a foreign language. You have to practice, and it feels clunky at first, and it takes a lot to think very purposefully and integrate.
Definitely.
But when it's really powerful.
I think in Reggio Emilia, they actually spend so much time thinking of questions. Like questioning a child is not always spontaneously done. Sometimes they like really, and that actually, now something's coming up in my brain. There were times like we would have like when we're doing a project experience, it would be a conversation with children, right? And I'd have like my co-teacher or somebody writing down, kind of transcribing the conversation, because it's difficult to write and talk at the same time. But the most powerful conversations I had were the ones where I really thought about the questions in advance. They weren't necessarily spontaneous like this. They were really thoughtfully kind of curated. When I compare those to the spontaneous conversations I have, yes, there's a value to both, but they do really talk about questioning and like intentional language in Reggio as well.
So I knew we'd go off on some tangents, because now you're making me think of two things. One is Ron Richard's visible thinking and thinking routines, and I think kind of adding that into the mix and adding some of those thinking routines into the mix, very intentionally planned, purposefully paired with the kind of learning and the kinds of thinking that you want to elicit from a learning situation. That's where some really deep learning can happen. But it's such a huge skill to purposefully plan that thinking routine or series of questions to bring out the learning that you're hoping will happen.
And then be prepared to pivot with, and like what's happening right now, unexpected directions will happen in the conversation. But if you have at least like 2 to 3 really powerful questions, that's going to make all the difference.
And I think even having like a few thinking routines at your fingertips. So when we interviewed Ron Richard, I've just been looking back at the old Learning Pioneers interviews, and I think we interviewed him about 18 months ago. And we were reading his book, Making Thinking Visible. He's got a new one, which is very exciting. Definitely needs to go on the reading list. But we asked him about what his favorite thinking routines were, or which ones he kind of found most useful or endlessly useful. And one of them, he said, was what makes you think that. And that is, to have that in your back pocket is so powerful. And we started looking at how we could use that in play, and it's just so easy to slot in, at any time. Oh, what makes you think that? It's just so natural.
Definitely. There was one we learned actually in Reggio from one of the atelierists. It was an Italian, so we kind of translated to English, and it wasn't as eloquent, but basically our rendition was, what comes in your brain when you see that, or what comes to mind. But it was a little difficult to say that in English, but they use that a lot.
That's so open-ended, isn't it? Yeah. Especially with young children, because there's all sorts of interesting things going on in their lives. That was so then the other link I was making was about, so you were talking about Reggio Emilia and kind of projects, often like it's very child-led, isn't it? It's very kind of inspired by children. But so like it's just making me think, because this time last year I was in northern England around kind of Leeds area, kind of around the Yorkshire Dales, and I visited 3 schools, 2 reggio inspired nursery early year settings, which were just stunning. You were talking about beauty. My goodness, I'd have loved to have. I just wanted to be in their environments. And the learning was really purposeful, and the focus of art just beautiful. So 2 early years reggio settings contrasted with visiting XP School, which is a project-based learning inspired by Ron Berger's work with expeditionary learning schools. So they learn through expeditions, which are like long-term projects. You know, yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. Like it was, and talk about having relationships at the heart of what you do. Like, yeah. Really fantastic school to visit. And it occurred to me visiting them both, you're doing a similar thing, but with a slightly different way. So they both had agency at the heart. They both had a really meaningful outcome. So both places were saying, yeah, we took our like the early year setting, we took it to the library and we published books and we put them in the local library. And XP School were doing equally as meaningful things, like kind of having YouTube channels, or like again having things in expositions in museums, like really always working towards a meaningful outcome. So yet the slight difference was with the reggio, in the reggio setting, it was they were picking up on what the children were into and then gauging where that was going. And because of largely in a UK secondary setting where there are a huge amount of accountability, in XP School that was very carefully linked. Every project was very carefully linked with the curriculum and kind of planned out. So it was done with an incredibly thoughtful teaching team who collaborated together. So that's where I kind of saw the difference a little bit. That reggio felt like it was more kind of leading from the child, and the project-based learning setting I was in was more that the adults had tailored it very, very carefully. So yeah, I was just making that link.
I think yes, in an ideal world. I think in reggio, it's very child-led, but then it depends, because when you're not in reggio, you're reggio inspired, right? So you have to work with your contacts. So a lot of times you'll have a reggio school that's working with a curriculum. So yes, sometimes it's not always necessarily as child-led as it should be, because you're kind of in that, having that to battle that tension, you know. So in my experience, I've definitely seen environments where that happens, where you do have to kind of like tailor it, but look at your curriculum too. But another link that I really see between the learning power approach and reggio is that as an LPA teacher, you yourself are imaginative. You yourself are, you know, resilient, collaborative, curious. You have really, really developed learning muscles, and that's exactly what reggio kind of talks about as well. As reggio frames, if we're talking about image of the child, the image of the teacher is that the teacher is a researcher. We're actually called researchers. That's a very, very big piece of language that's used in a reggio environment. Everything about teaching in a reggio environment is intentional. So there's a lot of work that happens behind the scenes between teachers, co-teachers, atelieristas, administrators, everybody. We're always discussing what happened. That's why documentation is so powerful. It's interesting that the name of the book was Making Thinking Visible, because in reggio we say making learning visible. It's very big part of it. That's through documentation. What I mean by that is that we're constantly taking photos of the children as they learn. We're constantly writing down their quotes, transcribing conversations, looking at their work, and then we'll sit down as a teaching team later on and we'll go over it. In fact, we actually sometimes put our scribbles on the wall so parents can see like what's happening behind the scenes. And we're discussing like, okay, this one said that one said this, there's some links, some connections we can make, and through that we plan the next experiences or the next maybe that this is always a huge part of our project learning journey, is that we'll kind of have an experience, we'll document it, then we'll reflect, and we'll take it from there. We'll use that
Mm,
to guide us
mm.
to create the next experience. So yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. So I was just looking at, I love that link with how an adult might behave. And just from what you're describing there with the documentation and those discussions, that again links to the learning power approach, because you're collaborating, you need to be collaborative, you're part of a conversation, and you're being reflective, you're being constantly reflective, and really importantly, you're listening. You're
Yeah.
really listening to what's going on.
Definitely. That's a
Yeah.
huge part of it, the pedagogy of listening, they call it. I'll give you a really silly example of this. A couple of years ago, my co-teacher and I, our project was on bees and butterflies. And we got so into it, but we were thinking like, we don't know enough about bees. And, in Thailand, there weren't enough bees on our campus. So we actually found this apiary. And during our break, we went to this apiary, and did a little bit of research, and we documented it and put it in our project learning journey, and showed it to the children, and they loved it. And then they started showing us, what they do
Mm.
outside of school. And it turns out one of the other children's parents knew about this apiary. So that's kind of how it's supposed to be. You're supposed to actually model being curious, enthusiastic. And another thing, some of the best projects I've had are on topics that I know nothing about. Sometimes it's nice to the children are interested in something you're really passionate about, so it's goes really well. You want to be enthusiastic, but other times when it's about something you have no idea, you learn with them. So you are the
Mm.
researcher. They are researchers with you.
Yeah, well, then it's really authentic as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because you're authentically saying, "Oh my goodness, I found this thing out," and you'll never guess what.
Yeah.
And you've taught me something so
Yeah.
empowering.
And you're modeling, discomfort. Sometimes I was like, I don't know bees, I don't know anything about them. So you're
Mm.
modeling how to overcome those hurdles.
Yeah, you're modeling how to be a learner, and also that kind of visible process of learning would be something that would be very part of a learning powered classroom, like a visible journey of learning, and kind of seeing where all the bumps along the way were, and so that you're seeing not just that finished product of like, look at this amazing thing we came up with. It's like, this is where we started and we didn't really know much, and so we had to go and find out about this, and this was a skill we didn't really have to, we had to practice this, and that we tried, this was our first draft, and then we realized we needed to get expert
Oh,
advice from
yeah.
this person. So it's not just like, you're brilliant at that, look at this amazing thing you produced. Like, a lot of hard thinking and process went into that.
Yeah, and there's so many times that you'll hit a wall. Your project learning journey, you're kind of like, "Oh no, where are we gonna go here?" And then, you put that in part, you include that in the final product when you present it to parents in however way. You show that, it wasn't perfect. It's a landscape. Learning
Yeah.
kind of, it's not always a linear journey.
Well, that's just really authentic to, what's true in life then, isn't it? So
Mhm.
that then, and this is like the kind of really powerful thing about learning in a learning powered way,
Yep.
is that you're preparing children for, I think Guy talks about, like, not just the tests in school, but the tests of life. As soon as you leave school, and anyway in your life within school, there are times when things don't go to plan, and there are times when things are so challenging you don't really know what to do, and there are times when you feel lost, and the more you experience that and get to the other side, the easier it is when the next big challenge comes along, and life is full of them, and you can then pivot and cope with that.
As someone who's in the midst of a transition right now, I can attest to all of those things.
Yeah, yeah, and being in that transition, as uncomfortable as it feels, and as uncomfortable as that might feel, you can draw upon and know there's another side to it, because you've been here before,. But in a different light.
Definitely.
It's like it, and then that is building resilience. Basically, it builds
Yeah,
your resilience.
absolutely.
um
It's a test right
okay.
now.
So we'll pause things there. I did have one wrap-up question, but I actually have two. So the first one is to do with, we've had a series of posts on going out on social media, and part of what I've been doing with traveling around and visiting different schools and connecting with different educators, is trying to build up this question of what should be at the heart of education, because we all know there already is a shift, but we need to shift. We need to be listening to children and thinking about what is really going to make a difference to their lives now and in the future, and talking to children and students about that and reshaping education based on that. So I've just been asking people, what do you think should be at the heart of education? So that is my question for you. What do you think should be at the heart of education?
I feel like we've already touched upon this in this conversation itself. For me, it's just empowering everybody. Education is a journey that's taken by the child, the teacher, and the families too. So empowering everybody, empowering the adult is huge, and empowering leaders to empower the teachers. And yeah, it's full circle.
Yeah, I love that. It's one of my favorite words. And linked with that is value, I think, valuing everybody and
Yes.
seeing everyone.
Yeah.
When we interviewed Jazz Amplifar last year, our theme was on positive disruption without getting burned. So how can we bring forward ideas and bring forward a vision without getting hurt in the process? Because you can try, if you're a bit of a change maker and you can see a problem and you try and bring that forward, sometimes it doesn't land so well. Exactly. So we need to think about how to protect ourselves. And she talked about relationships with parents, for example, and she was saying, but do those parents really know that you're for them? Do they know that you're on their side?
Yeah.
And they're not going to know that unless you go out of your way to show it.
Exactly.
It's not a given. So that empowerment first comes from seeing, hearing, valuing, caring for, not judging, and they're connecting and making that relationship.
Exactly. It's a really delicate balance with parents, because sometimes you don't want to shame anybody, like you want to definitely make them feel safe with you, just as you nurture the children. You don't have to nurture parents in the same way, but you can provide them with, a feeling of, that they know that you're there to support them.
Withness. That would be Mark Finnis's thing, withness, showing that you're with them.
Yeah.
We've got a comment here from Yazan. He says, I believe creating engaged, compassionate, lifelong learners who have skills required for the future. 100%. You are in the right place, Yazan.
Beautiful.
Really nicely described as well. And compassionate. We've touched on compassion, but I think that is just the kind of the learning power element of developing empathy. So important,
Yes, that's something that I really developed during COVID. I really, working with families, and it was a struggle for everyone, and it really gave me this gigantic surge of empathy for families. It's not easy. Yes, sure, a teacher's job is not easy either, but a parent, it's just, we have to work together. We have to kind of, try to understand each other's perspective before we can think of supporting a child.
And that could be a really positive thing to have come out of, the pandemic, is so many things. But if you're recognizing that in that online scenario, the power of empathy and connection and compassion, and we've talked a lot in Learning Pioneers about, right, okay, we saw all these things in lockdown, we saw how learning could be different, and we saw how things shifted. Let's not forget that. So again, coming back to the Kath Murdoch thing, if we saw compassion, care, and connection there, how do we bring that back into school and just make that part of what we do?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, that was my first question. And my second one, because we're talking about meaningful, purposeful, and joyous, I was thinking about joy, and I thought I'd ask you, what's bringing joy into your life at the moment?
At the moment, so many things. It's really interesting. I mean, Learning Pioneers, I'm not even joking. It's really, really helping me through this transition. It's very, sorry, the phone is ringing and just ignore that. So that for sure. And sorry, that's very distracting.
Have you got a real telephone, like a proper?
I have a landline randomly. I don't know why. I don't use it.
That's amazing. I don't think I've heard that in years.
I set it up, and I'm kind of regretting setting it up. Okay, it's done.
You can't put it on silent. You have to take
That's
it off the
not
hook.
bringing me joy. Honestly, it's so interesting to make this transition, and I'll be honest, this new schedule, it's very flexible. A year ago, I would have given anything for this idea that, oh, I can be home, whatever. But it's actually kind of challenging, this idea that I'm working contract. But it is giving me joy, learning how to, you know, use my skills in a different way, learning how to manage myself. It's really interesting. I'm definitely getting a lot of confidence from it. So that,
Yeah.
and then I would have said the weather, but we just had a massive kind of snowfall. So I'm trying to find the joy in that.
It's so
Autumn
funny.
was beautiful.
Different weathers and things are so funny. Like my
Yeah,
husband loves snow. It's his favorite thing. So I'll probably get off this chat and I'll go and say to him, "It's been snowing in Canada," and he'll be like, "I
send you
want to get
some
on the
pictures.
plane." But yeah. Okay. So the weather and your new situation and everything in Learning Pioneers.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Love it. Right, thank you so much, Tara. I've loved that
Ooh,
conversation. So we were
great.
chatting earlier and talking about inspiring inspiration in others, and you're definitely somebody who inspires me and inspires new thinking and new ideas and new creativity. So I hope that anyone who tunes in later or anyone who's been part of that, I hope that's inspired some thinking for you too.
I feel the same way about you, Becky. Always inspired by our conversations.
Thank you so much. Enjoy your day. You've
Bye
got a fog day
bye.
ahead of you.
Take care.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.